Welcome, everybody, back to Seasons Ebb and Flow. I am Lee Wright. Thank you for joining us today. I will be interviewing Tina Keys today. She is a divorce coach and a mediator here in Central Florida, and she has various certifications, which she will share a little bit more about in a second. And today we're going to be speaking about being a step parent, especially a stepmom. And we're going to talk a little bit about both coming into a relationship where you don't have kids and your partner does, and then talk a little bit about having kids when you already have some step kids and creating that blended family and what that process can look like and the challenges and rewards with that whole process. So before we dive right in, I'm just going to turn it over to Tina and ask her to tell us a little bit about how she got to where she's at today, what path she took to become a divorce coach, what led her to that in the mediation. Tina.
Hi, thanks, Lee. Yes, I'm Tina Keys. I have a business, Florida Divorce Coaching and Mediation. In my prior career, was in the financial world, had a bookkeeping business for small businesses for a very long time, and became a stepmom during that time. I've been a stepmom now for over a decade. And that is really what led me into this line of work, wanting to help families get through the divorce process with less conflict, less expense, less stress, and ultimately less trauma for the kids. That's what I'm about. Mostly what I do is pro se mediation, which means working with two parents together. Most of my clients don't have lawyers, and just helping them guide them through the divorce process in a very non-traditional way that is super low conflict, low cost, keeps them out of court, and helps them learn how to co-parent better. So that's really what I'm about. I also work with people individually as a divorce coach, as you know. And then I work especially with special needs families as well, who need to have a lot more detail in their parenting plans and really take that time to work through all of that together and get on the same page.
How
So.
did you end up with kind of that specialization along with everything else?
Yeah, so I have one of my sons is neurodivergent, and that's been something that as a parent has been challenging, but also rewarding. And just come to find through many conversations with professionals in this space how under supported families are who have children with unique and different needs.
Yeah.
So that's just, it's a passion of mine. All my continuing education right now is really focused on special needs, understanding what different families are going through and trying to help support them. If there's any family that needs to get through divorce with a low cost and less conflict, it's a family with a special needs or disabled child, because those resources would be much better spent elsewhere. So
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
really what I'm about.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like for all parents, the concept of trying to save all that money from going to lawyers to keep your family money with your family and uh, not using lawyers generally will keep that money in the family much more than once you include lawyers, a lot of times it just snowballs. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, it's like my goal is just to help parents learn how to talk to each other again in a
Yeah.
more professional manner. And I think, unfortunately, even with the most well-meaning attorneys, sometimes just that setup of one lawyer talking to another lawyer and the parents not necessarily talking to each other just creates
Totally.
a strange dynamic and just makes it hard for people to learn how to even talk to each other at all after a divorce. So,
Yeah, it takes
yeah.
so long for many couples to learn how to co-parent after going through an adversarial divorce, and it doesn't have to be like that. So,
Right.
yeah. All right, so today we're going to talk a little bit about step parenting,
Yeah.
which is a topic that I think doesn't get discussed as much as it should because it's a very specific role and there's a lot of dynamics involved. And
Mhm.
so maybe we can start out just talking about how you came into your current relationship. You didn't
Yeah.
have kids, but he had kids, and
Yeah.
what that the transition felt like for you as a young new stepmom.
Yeah. So yeah, my stepsons, call them my sons. You know, I've been in their lives since they were 5 and 7. They're now 15, almost 18, which is impossible to believe at this
Yeah,
point that I
yeah.
almost have an adult stepson. And then we have two biological sons together as well, now 3 and almost 6. So 4 boys, all the ages, all the life stages right now.
Yeah.
But yeah, they were 5 and 7, and I was 26. I was very young. I had never been married, never had kids. Was just had been in a long-term relationship prior, almost 6 years that didn't end well, and then living a single life, working, own a business, doing my thing, and then met my husband. He told me night one when I met him, I have kids, and
Mhm.
my first question was, can I see pictures of them? I didn't even, for me, it wasn't like a negative. It was always a positive. I always wanted to be a mom and have a family, and like there was never I never viewed it negatively at any point.
Sure.
It was always a positive. I like that he was sort of established in that role and his children were so important to him.
Mhm.
And it was a pretty, I would say, easy introduction process early on. Like we really just, me and the kids bonded very quickly and easily early on. It never felt forced
How
or
long?
challenging
How
from
long?
that standpoint,
Yeah.
which I think is not the case for a lot of families. But I think because they were so young, they were very receptive to me, which was wonderful.
Mhm.
Um, and then I just sort of almost overnight, went from being this sort of single 26-year-old with no responsibilities to all of a sudden 50-50 time sharing, parenting plan, holiday schedule, certain communication protocols and rules, and exchanging with the ex-spouse, and trying to navigate all of that. It was like very overwhelming. I think that's
Yes.
something people don't really talk about enough, how that's just a jarring shift, right, in life.
Mhm.
Whereas
There's
when
a
you're
lot of complexities.
there is. And when you're a biological parent, you sort of have this ramp up time. You have this like 9 month period, and there's this whole like, process. You
Mhm.
read books and you listen to podcasts and you learn what is it going to look like with the newborn stage. And then
Yes.
you have the newborn and you realize you don't actually know anything. And then you have to figure it all out as you go. And that's kind of the same thing with step parenting. You don't really know until you're in it. And then you're just sort of constantly trying to, navigate each new phase. But
Yes, absolutely.
yeah.
Um, where sometimes I would imagine it's easier if the relationship, your partner's relationship with his ex is very amicable. Was
Mhm.
it overall a challenging dynamic, like with her accepting you coming into the picture, or how was it?
I don't know about I don't think it from accepting me coming into the picture. I don't see that as being an issue at all. I think their co-parenting dynamics were a bit challenging overall.
Mm.
As far as why or who or whatever. I don't generally get into those details publicly. And I think with any story, there's always two sides, and then there's somewhere in the middle is the truth, right? And that's how I look
Yes,
at my role now as a mediator too. When I talk to parents, it's he said, she said, and then what can we pull from this? That's probably the reality. I think
yeah.
any blended family has its challenges. You have, and this is one of the things that I really think is important to talk about. When you come into a dynamic as a step parent, right, there was a relationship that existed that
Mm.
established a certain type of household structure, hierarchy, rules, ways of doing things, bedtimes, expectations, value systems, religious practices, whatever it may be, right? You have this sort of system that was set up by two people, and then there's children that came from that system, and then the marriage ends, right? And so now each person after that marriage ends carries on then their own kind of modified version of that initial family system, right? They might take parts they liked, they leave the parts they didn't, and then there's usually they're not like I exactly the same, so there's already maybe some conflict between how each person runs their household.
Yes.
And then now enter a new step parent who, as an adult human, right, has a certain right to run their own household and their own life the way that they see fit or appropriate for themselves. And
Yes.
that may or may not align to fully to what, their new partner is doing, and certainly might not align to what their new partner's ex-partner might be doing,
Yeah.
right? And so now you've got sort of three adults, with different opinions on what it looks like to run a household. And that's really hard.
Yes.
That's really hard because sometimes, it as a step parent, it can constantly feel like you're compromising your own way that you want to do things in your house,
Hmm.
because of this system that was already established before you that you had no say in. And that
Right.
is very contrary to when you create a marriage with a person, have children together, and stay together. You guys are
Mm.
100% in control of that system. Um,
Yes.
and it inherently leads to conflict. It's really, I mean, even in the best of cases.
Absolutely. There's even in married couples challenging dynamics at
Yeah.
times, parenting, people have different discipline styles
Yeah.
under the same roof, and having to navigate coming to an agreement on how you want to manage that. So then in divorced couples, you have that as well. It's just,
Mhm.
and I remind my clients that you didn't always have control over your spouse's choices or decisions when you lived under the same roof. You're going to have even less control over how they parent when they're in a separate household. And you have to learn to handle your own uh, control desires and accept that your children are going to have possibly a very different household when they go to your ex partner. And
Mhm.
there's pros to that as well. Like, I look at it, I know my household is run very differently than my ex's, and his new wife stays home. She spends a lot of time in the kitchen, and like that is the dynamic in their household. And I have a much more, I work and I have a much, in some respects, tighter relationship with my kids, but I also give them a lot of free reign in many
Mhm.
ways that maybe he keeps things a little tighter. And I feel like, well, now my kids are exposed to very different parenting styles, very different household styles. And the more exposure you have in life, the more choices that you now are aware of, so that you can make really smart choices for yourself when you get older on how you want to run your household. So I like to remind people that we can look at something as a negative, or you can see the silver lining. And,
Mhm.
but yeah, running households and parenting with discipline and bedtimes, minutia stuff it can be very interesting, just figuring that out. And I think the communication between the partners on
Mhm.
navigating that is really important.
Yeah, I think there's like so I'm very much like a type A personality. I like to kind of have things a certain way and run a certain way. And that I was very much like that when I met my husband. And I had to let go of a lot of things over the years. I think I've learned what my role looks like in their lives. I think that it's changed as the years have gone on, obviously between age 5 and age 15 or 17, just like they do as a biological parent. But I
Sure.
think like it's not as clear or obvious. Like when you're a step parent, trying to figure out like what am I supposed to be doing here? I think for somebody like me, I've always been a type A high achiever type personality, right? And I don't mean high achiever like, oh, look at my resume. I mean, like, I have really high expectations for myself. I don't, excuse my French, half-ass things. It's not my
Yeah.
temperament. It's not what I represent in any area of my life. So when I became a stepmom, of course, naturally, I was like, I'm going to be the best stepmom that ever lived, right? Because that's how I am. And I put tons of pressure on myself always to rise to that because it's just who I am, for better or worse. And for worse often, to be honest with you. I put a lot of stress on myself. It's just who I am as a person. I think a lot of people can relate to that. A lot of moms, stepmoms probably,
Absolutely. Trying to
um,
do it all.
do too much. Yeah. And so I think, as a stepmom, I was, cooking the meals every night, making sure the laundry was done, checking the homework sheets, doing the things, trying to be all the things that I thought I needed to be when they were with us. Um, and I was burning out constantly,
Yeah,
to be honest with you. Especially once we had biological children, I was like very burnt out. And I think I can imagine on the other side, probably their mom felt kind of like, she's trying to do all the things I'm supposed to be doing. And it was never that intention, but it was just me wanting to show up for them and make them feel loved and make them
yeah,
feel like they are my family, regardless of blood. Like I care for them and I'm going to always be here for them.
yeah.
But I do believe there's a lot of that friction that can happen in those family dynamics because the line is not clear. Like when you're
No,
a biological mother, there's no line.
yeah,
You decide. You do what you do. If you have
yeah.
a meltdown in front of your kids, you're just like, oops, sorry. They still love you unconditionally.
Mhm,
Um, you generally don't know what you're doing and you just figure it out as you go, but there's no one there to like watch you struggle, right?
mhm.
And they're young. But when you inherit a relationship with children, like day one, they're impressionable. 5 and 7 years
Mhm.
old, they're looking at you like, who are you? What are you doing in my life? And like, it's that constant, like, should I love you? Do you deserve my love? That's what I was telling myself, which probably
Right.
isn't what they were feeling. But in my
Yeah,
mind, like, if I don't do everything perfect, then they won't love me. And then I
right,
won't have my husband and I'll lose everything that I've built. And
right.
it's this sort of weird psychological thing I think for stepmoms that they don't ever like they're always scared that that
Mhm.
relationship will fall apart if the relationship
Yeah,
falls apart, and it is very
right.
stressful, honestly, it really is,
Mhm.
especially early on when you haven't built that foundation with the
That
children yet.
really deep foundation, which gives you
Yeah,
security. Yeah.
yeah,
I'm
security is
sure those
important.
abandonment fears probably, we all have them
Yeah.
to some degree, and that is definitely a trigger.
Yeah, because I think there's a reality when you're a biological parent that like those kids are legit dependent on you until they are out of school. Like they can't
Yes.
be without you because they rely on you. And by the way, legally, they also have to be with you, right? So there is a sense of kind of, security, like you said, and stability and comfort in that where you feel like you can make more mistakes and they're not going anywhere. But when you're a
Right.
step parent, your role is not guaranteed.
Hmm.
And that relationship with the kids can actually cause massive turbulence in your marriage if it's not good. So
Yes,
it's a
absolutely.
constant fear, I think, for
Hmm.
stepmoms to screw up and then be hated. And,
Yes,
there's already a weird stigma a lot of times for stepmoms, like
totally.
there in the world. So it's just
Hmm.
it's honestly it's been the most challenging role of my life by far.
Yeah.
I've felt very misunderstood at many turns. I've felt lost a lot of the time. It's just been really a difficult role to manage. It's been one of the most rewarding things I've done in my life. My stepsons are two of my favorite people, and I mean, they're awesome. And knowing that I'm a part of who they've become and their story is just awesome, but
Yes.
it's been a road. I mean,
Yeah.
internally for me, it's been quite a road to this point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I am actually a newer step parent because my boyfriend's daughter, who's 16, just
Mhm.
moved in with us about 2 months ago. So I
Yeah.
am in the early days of adjusting, and overall, it's going really well. And I
Yeah.
have a
Teenager.
sixteen-year-old daughter who lives with us. So
Yeah.
I went from one teenage daughter to two teenage girls under the same roof. And it's luckily they get along wonderfully, and the adjustment has been really smooth considering, because it happened very unexpectedly.
Mhm.
And there have been like the adjustment has been more than anything. Me and my boyfriend have very different parenting styles. He
Yeah.
comes from a conservative background, just a very culturally from Latin America, just a different style of parenting in some respects. And
Mhm.
we knew that we had different parenting styles long before she moved in here, and we discussed those differences. And I had read a book when my kids were young called Free Range Kids, which was all about giving them a lot of freedom and long leashes when you feel they're ready. And my kids have very long leashes and have
Mhm.
most of the time lived up to that, so I didn't have to rein them in. But
Yeah.
it's not probably the more typical American style parenting either. But we've had, a lot of conversations, and he didn't have a teenager living with him for a long time, and just him getting his head around the difference between parenting teenagers and younger kids is very
Oh yeah,
different.
very different.
So yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's something that you just have to constantly process and work together and hear each other's different sides. And obviously the blood parent generally gets the final decision for their child, but
Right.
at least I think it's really important to respect where each person is coming from and hear each other out, because I've adapted and changed my parenting slightly from his influence and vice versa.
Mhm.
But as a
And the kids will probably
relationship,
be better off for it, honestly. They'll
uh,
probably be happier because of that, you know? It'll probably end up being
definitely.
positive.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, and I,
Yeah.
I was definitely fortunate in that, with my husband, he in his prior marriage, he was the step parent in that dynamic. And so I think
Um,
that helped us in our marriage because he understood some of the stuff that I was going through emotionally during that
Interesting.
time, where I can imagine that had he not experienced it, he might not have understood a lot of that.
Yes.
And so I think that actually did help us. So I would, encourage people who, if you've got a partner coming into a dynamic as a step parent, especially if they don't have their own kids, like to really understand that this is not a role that anybody gets trained for. It is very hard in the same way that, when you become a biological parent, nobody really trains you for it. It's all the
Yes.
things like how many times do you're walking to the grocery store and you hear somebody, oh, I would never do that. My kid would never behave like that. And I'm
Oh
like,
my
okay,
gosh.
do you have
Yeah.
any kids? Oh,
Yeah.
you're pregnant with my friend.
Just
Okay,
wait.
call me in two
Just
years.
wait.
Call me in
Yes.
2 years and let me know how that's
Mhm.
going. Because that's how
Totally.
it is, right? Like you think you know everything before you have kids, and then you have kids, and then you're like, wow, okay, this is really hard.
It's
And so I
really
think that's as
tough.
a step parent, the same thing. You come into something, you didn't have the luxury of those years to figure all that stuff out. And now you just don't know what you don't know, and you're trying to, navigate it the best you can. And a lot of times, especially if you're marrying into a dynamic that already has conflict or communication challenges, um, that's hard because you're kind of already set up to fail in a way. Like,
Mhm.
even if you have the best motive and you want to try and, be friendly and do all the right things,
Yes.
unfortunately, you're walking into something that maybe is not set up to be conducive to that.
Exactly.
And I think that happens to a lot of people,
Yeah.
where unfortunately it's just their dynamic is not functional. And so then you coming into it just makes everything even worse. And that's not helping anything, but you just have to learn to navigate it the best way you can.
Yes.
Yeah, but I've definitely learned a lot of lessons over the years about, it's okay not to be perfect. I've
Hmm.
taken that pressure off of myself. And it's okay not to be everything to them, like
Yeah.
everything for them. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
As far as like, it's okay if something, if I just kind of let it be and let the parents figure it out. Like I don't need to be the one driving these conversations.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah. It comes back again to control. Like,
yeah,
okay, this is
100%.
something that I don't need to have control over. And
Yeah,
it's not
right.
easy to like, you have to consciously remind yourself of that periodically, because we're
Yeah.
so used to like managing everything in our little world. And if you have strong opinions, but sometimes you just have to rein yourself in and be like, that I don't need to handle that. It's just
Mhm.
I can support without giving my 2 cents.
Yeah,
But
and I got to a place with my stepsons too, where I felt like we built a certain foundation in the relationship where I kind of learned that it's okay to be vulnerable in that relationship and to not be perfect all the time. There were a
yes.
lot of years when they were younger where I felt like I had to be perfect
Mm,
always. I could
yeah.
never slip up. I could never. cry in front of them. I could never show weakness. I could never, because I didn't want them to think that I wasn't worthy of their love or a place in their
Mhm.
lives. And so I
Yeah,
think, and that was that pressure I was putting on myself. I'm sure they didn't feel that way at 8 years old, but I,
right.
was telling myself this. And, I think the more pressure I took off of myself, the stronger our relationships actually got. And, we have a very different
Absolutely.
relationship now. They're teenagers. I've kind of
Mhm.
stepped out of a lot of things and I'm sort of there just more as an advisor, and I help, if they ask me for help, I'm there. They know, like they know if they call me 2:45 in the morning, I don't care where you are, like they know I'm going to show up. I have no
Yeah.
doubt there. But I'm also not trying to insert myself in places where I don't need to be
Yes.
at this point in their lives. And I think you just have to find your own path to like what
Mm,
a healthy dynamic looks like for you. But
yes.
it's definitely not going to be linear. It's going to
Hmm.
be
Oh,
up
yeah.
and
It's
down,
a learning
not a
process.
linear path.
It's an iterative process. You try and you learn and you change tacks, and even the way you and your partner discuss things or figure out parenting, that's an iterative process together
Yeah.
as well. And I definitely think it's really healthy to avoid the perfection and shoot more for I'm a human being. I'm a full human being. I have a range of emotions, and you do too. And we both have, full rights to be human, to make mistakes. That's how we learn. And I
Mhm.
think everybody's better if we acknowledge that it's okay to make mistakes or not be perfect. Like a good example, even recently for me, is I've been running my household with my kids, and I have them mostly full time because their dad doesn't live in the country.
Mhm.
So since they were like 10 and 12, they've been with me full time, and now they're 17 and 19. And so running a household mostly single, there are lots of things that I was like, I will burn out if I try and do everything. So once they got into high school, it's really early mornings. I was like, I do not need to wake up with you guys. You can make
Right.
yourselves breakfast and get yourself off to school. And they did, and they did it well. And I was fine with that. I knew other moms got up with their kids, but that was not something that I could manage. I needed my sleep. But
Mhm.
now my boyfriend likes to wake up and make them breakfast and make their lunch and send them off
Mhm.
to school, which I think is amazing. And I'm
Right.
really happy that he likes doing that. And there's a tiny part of me that had to be like, okay, it's okay. You don't look like a slacker, even if you feel like you do. You
Yeah.
made those conscious decisions for the best, because I'm a better mom when I have a good amount of sleep. And I probably need more sleep than most people. And I've just had to accept that. And so, but it definitely, there's like a little like ego pride where I'm like, oh man, like, am I looking like really bad? And then I'm like, nope, I made the decisions that was best for me in that life situation, and things have changed, and it's wonderful that my daughter now gets breakfast made for her and her lunch packed in the morning. So, but
Well,
yeah.
and I think like as parents and step parents, like you just really at the end of the day, you have to back yourself and just know like this is who I am. And I've now learned the older, I'm now 36. I'm more seasoned in my life in general than when I was a young stepmom. I barely even knew who I was fully, let alone who am I as a stepmother, right? Like this is
Yeah.
and again, like I think I've learned now that every day that it's really about showing up and showing up authentically as who you are and what you represent. And the kids will see that and they will sort all that out when they're older. They will take the good from you and they will take the good from their mom and they will take the good from their dad and from their
Yes.
stepdad, and they will absorb the things that are meaningful to them and they will discard the things that don't work for them. And that's like whether you're a parent biologically or a step parent, like that is just the reality of raising children. They are adults a lot longer than they are children. And
Yes.
so, and they are not going to necessarily subscribe to every belief system that you have and every way of doing things that you do them, you know? So, and this is what I would encourage to stepmoms is there's a difference between trying to control everything and trying to, steamroll the processes that are in place and also setting boundaries for like what you need things to look like within your household. It's okay. Your house doesn't have to be just like the ex-wife's house because her kids live with you half the time, right? Like that's
Right.
not fair to you as an adult who is working hard to pay the bills, who's like trying to, do whatever you need to do to manage your household. You cannot, subscribe to someone else's belief systems, just like I don't expect my stepsons or my biological children to live their lives exactly as I do when they're adults,
Sure.
right? And like you said, Lee, I think like there's something to be gained from having two different households and lifestyles and way of viewing things if all the adults in the room can have that mindset. Where it
Definitely.
breaks down is when children get that messaging from parents that one parent's way is wrong, because
Right.
then that makes it hard for them to reconcile, because then they're like, well, something's wrong with my parent, there must be something wrong with me. And so that's where we get this kind of snowball effect. But and I think a lot of people do that unintentionally. I don't think it's on purpose, right? But I think it's very,
Yes.
unfortunately.
Yeah.
um
Yeah. It's so important for the step parent and the parents in both houses not to make negative comments about the other household. It's so detrimental to the kids. It confuses them, and yeah, they're genetically related to both parents. And so that is something that just every parent needs to remind themselves, like, you might not agree, but that doesn't mean that you need to tell your kids it's wrong.
mm. But also, I would say too, like you're gonna probably make mistakes, and things are gonna happen.
Inevitably.
They're gonna slip, because I will tell you, they slip in an intact marriage. I've been married. I've been with my husband for almost 10 years, and I have certainly said things to my kids like, "Oh my gosh, why does your dad do this?" Drives me
Totally.
crazy. Vice versa. Like this is just human nature. Like, and I think
Yes.
kids are generally more sensitive to that when there's a divorce in the mix, but you
Yeah.
are going to screw up. You're not going to get it
Yes.
right all the time. And
Right.
when you do, then at that point, you're just like, you know what? Probably shouldn't have said that. I'm sorry. Like
Yeah.
that's
Exactly.
kind of over the line. And I
And I
shouldn't
think there's a difference between saying like, oh, why does your dad do that? But there's no animosity or like you're trying to throw them under the bus. You're
have.
just like, I don't really like see why they made that decision versus like, there's a way that you say things that makes it like they are so wrong. Like, I don't
Yeah.
agree. And because it's healthy and we're all going to have different styles. That's normal.
Right.
But as long as we respect those differences, that's where I think the difference lies. So,
Yeah.
do you want to tell us a little bit about what it was like having your own kids and stepkids under one roof? Because that's a
Yeah.
whole nother unique situation.
Right. Yeah. So it was, yeah. So I think I'm trying to think back timeline wise. We were together for a few years when we got married, like all in. It's been 10 years, but I would say my relationship with the boys was already pretty well established before we had kids together. We were trying, we had a couple miscarriages, and that was tough. And then we had, which is challenging when you've got older kids and you lose a child during a pregnancy, explaining that to them, that was tough because they were excited, and you know,
Sure.
that was it's kind of a life lesson for them that we didn't intend to have to teach them. But yeah, that happened, and then we ended up having my son who's almost 6, and it was wonderful from the standpoint that the boys like really took to him, and had a really good relationship. It was really hard though for me, like, to balance everything. I will say, like, being a new mom period is hard. um
Yes.
Having a child, having, in my case, a very difficult birth. um and then everything that comes along with trying to learn how to be a parent for the first time to a newborn. And
Yeah,
then we at that point already had, the two older boys who were both, I think, in elementary school at that point. Um, trying to manage that schedule and still, have a newborn, have older kids. I think that's hard, whether they're your biological kids or stepsons.
absolutely.
And then I struggled too sometimes with this feeling of like I was very hyper aware of the fact that I didn't want them to feel like I loved my son
Yes,
more than I loved them.
sure.
And that was really hard to try to figure out how to convey that, but then not be like over the top, over the top,
Yes,
and there's this kind of inherent, babies are cute and people are like, oh, all of that comes
so
along
yeah,
with
they get
it.
so much attention. Even when
Yeah,
they're all your blood children, like you.
right, right.
Yeah, I felt sad when I brought my daughter home for my son because I knew he was young, he was only 2, like it was gonna be really hard, and it was. He would tell
Hmm.
me to put her down all the time, like
Right.
put baby down. So yeah,
Well,
it's
and what had ended up happening again, Lee, is like my high achiever over indexing personality came out again. And because I had so much anxiety about, being perceived as loving that child more than them, which I didn't. The love is different. I will say as a biological parent, it's a different relationship for sure. But in some ways, there's almost more meaning to the love you have for your stepchildren because you chose them, and your
yes,
biological child you created, and you like in a sense almost have to love them. It's a
yeah,
different dynamic. So I wouldn't say
mhm,
one is more than the other. I think they're just different, right?
yeah,
But I was so hyper fixated on like not letting them ever feel lesser than, that I was obsessively showing up to everything, still trying to cook all the meals, show up to all the practices. I would bring my son in the baby stroller to every football game, to every practice. I mean, I was like everywhere,
wow,
because I never wanted them to feel like, oh, now she doesn't show up to anything because she's got the
right,
baby. But then I was freaking exhausted. I was
yes,
so exhausted. I was like running myself ragged. And it was just, and then once I had the second one,
oh my
that was even
gosh,
worse because I was
yes,
like, and we moved too. So we moved households. I was like trying to move, have a newborn, a toddler who was also very hyperactive due to being neurodivergent, and like that he had his own set of challenges.
oh
And the
wow,
older two were, in middle school. And we had, by the way, COVID happened in between all of that. So that was its own whole,
yeah,
the state work from homes, school, all that. Um, so yeah, just try like obsessively trying to show up to things to make sure that they didn't ever feel lesser than. I definitely burnt myself out.
yeah,
I think that's something that probably a lot of stepmoms can identify with, because you never want to make anyone feel undervalued or unvalued, but meanwhile
mhm,
you're like, what I've come to learn now is it's okay to just be honest and say, hey, I can't make this because I've got
yes,
other responsibilities or other commitments, or to be honest with you, I am exhausted and I
yeah,
just can't make it happen, but let's do XYZ tomorrow to make up for that. It's okay.
exactly,
Like if
yeah,
you show up to 8 out of 10 games, they're still
mhm,
gonna love you even
yes,
if you don't show up to all 10. Do you know what I
e-
mean? Like I think that's something that I wish more people would know. Like it's okay to not be perfect.
mhm,
Um, they're still gonna love you.
absolutely,
They're not gonna hate you because of that, or
yeah.
be resentful.
And I think teenagers, especially, like they need a lot of sleep. They lie around all the time. And if
Yeah,
they see you like running around with it like a chicken without a head, and then that you're just so exhausted because you're trying to do everything that you're not even able to enjoy when you're there or something, like
yeah,
if you can easily have conversations with them and say like, I want to show up and I love you and support you, but I need to rest too because I am getting depleted. Like I think it's so important, whether you're a step parent or a parent, that you communicate honestly with your kids and recognize that we're human beings, we're not robots, we don't have endless energy, we get older, and they can understand, and uh, it's healthy for them to not expect us to be able to do it all. And
Mhm.
so I think it's just
Yeah.
part of being
I've
human.
learned I've learned to outsource things too that I just don't have the bandwidth for. I think that's something like because my career is really important to me, that's something, and building this business now over the last few years, in addition to running another company and having four children spread through various age demographics, like I've had to have that conversation with myself that it is okay to
Mhm.
not do everything. And
Yeah,
so I have a meal delivery service that delivers the meals for, my husband and I and the older kids, and then the younger ones are still in the chicken nuggets and,
right.
they eat five things age group. So that's a little bit, hot dogs, chicken nuggets, and like three other foods. And then other than
Yes.
that, it's an argument. And you know what? I don't have the bandwidth for that argument. So at this point, it's chicken
Mhm.
nuggets and hot dogs, and it won't be in
Right.
2 years. But right now it is, and that's okay. And that's kind of where I'm
Exactly.
at. It's like I've had to learn as not only a step parent, but as a mother, as a human, period, right? But definitely as a step parent, that it's okay to not check every box.
Yes.
Because the value that you're providing is not like the only thing. Like that's not what makes people love you. It's making them feel loved and showing up for them emotionally and being
Yes.
there. For the fun moments and all of that. And if all you're doing is running yourself ragged, then you can't really be present for that stuff. So, um,
Exactly.
yeah, I think that's a really important lesson for any mom, stepmom, woman, period. But
Mhm.
definitely when you're juggling as many things, it's funny, like sometimes when I talk to people, be like, oh yeah, I have, four kids, two are my stepsons, they're teenagers, and then two are younger, and then I've got two companies. I start like listing off just like my normal life to introduce myself, and they're like, whoa, that's like a lot. And I'm like, I guess it is, but when you're in it, you don't think about it. You're just kind of like grinding through the days. But it
Yes.
it's okay. Like if you have a lot on your plate and you're managing a lot, it's okay to not do it all, and to
Yes.
for help in the spaces where you just cannot
Hmm.
take one more thing. Like it's just too much.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's important to find that balance, like trial and error for each of us, and it changes as your kids get older.
Hmm.
Um, I'm just looking to see if uh there's anything else that I didn't ask you. Is there any last tidbits that you'd like to throw in on this topic? I mean, we've covered a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just like my overarching message to people is to be kinder to yourself. And I think there's something too that I would say if by chance there's a mom, ex-wife out there somewhere who ends up stumbling on this video, give the stepmom the benefit of the doubt. You know what I mean? Like, don't assume the worst of her
Yes,
intentions. Don't assume that she's trying to overstep. Don't assume that she's, trying to do something nefarious. This is just like if you think back to when you first became a parent, how hard that was and how many mistakes you made and how imperfect you were in those moments and how much grace
yeah,
you had to give yourself. Like it's the same for a new step parent, whether stepmom or stepdad. I think
yeah.
though, Lee, I'm gonna be honest with you, like stepdads get a lot more grace generally.
Oh, for
Like, they're
sure.
just kind of like, and society views stepdads differently than stepmoms. I'll be honest with you.
Yeah, the
It's kind of like,
expectations of what they should and
yeah,
shouldn't be doing are just so
right.
much easier in general.
Yeah, I think for stepmoms, it's like a damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? Like you're
Yes.
supposed to love them unconditionally, but don't love them too, like don't show
Mm,
too much love or step on too
right.
many things.
Or
Like you're
yeah,
supposed to
try
show
and
up for them,
replace.
but not more than the biological parents. Like
Yes.
it's all these things that it's really hard to balance. And I think, when stepmoms cross that line or go into the corners maybe they're not supposed to be into, I think a lot of times I don't think it's malicious in most cases. I'm sure there are some
Yes,
where maybe it is,
absolutely.
but
Yeah.
I don't think that's the majority. I think it would probably be the best case scenario if all the parents were amicable enough to sit down together and have an open conversation about that. But unfortunately, that's usually not the case. Um,
Yeah.
but just like give people the benefit of the doubt. Don't like assume the worst. I tell this to my parents too when I do, divorce
Right.
mediation. I say that to them. A lot of times we actually write it into the agreement for parents to
Mhm.
give each other the benefit of the doubt and not
Yeah.
assume that whatever their child is telling them is actual reality, because sometimes
Yeah.
it's not, or sometimes it's skewed.
Right.
I think that would be, a lot happier, more happy blended families if everybody would just not assume the worst every time anything happens. And that goes all directions. I'm
Mhm.
not just saying ex-wife to stepmom. I'm saying like
Right.
ex-partners to each other, and so on. So
100%. Yeah, and I can speak to the adjusting to having my ex have his girlfriend who then became his wife. And there's definitely all those different emotions that come up when your kids are meeting them for the first time, and insecurities about, are your kids going to love them more? And they're not.
yeah,
But
yeah,
those are normal emotions that you're going to have to deal with and process. Um, and now it didn't take too long, but we're very amicable. We do holidays together, and that was like a really big priority for me. And there are
yeah,
so many things that I just choose your battles and choose not to handle, or to keep that amicable relationship. And like, even now, I acknowledge that she is a very good cook and she spends a lot of time in the kitchen. And I know when my kids are there, they get really, probably way more delicious meals. I cook, but I cook simple and basic and healthy.
yeah.
But, and, I have to just be okay with the fact that I know my kids probably like their meals there slightly better, or maybe a lot better for all I know.
Right.
And
Yeah.
and they will, when they come back to my house, sometimes they'll be like, "Oh, you should ask Bella for this recipe or whatever." And I just am like, "Okay, I will." And realize that my kids love me for who I am and what I
Yeah.
offer, and it's totally different than the things she probably offers. And it's more people to love them and role model
Yeah.
different things to them. And uh, in many respects, more is better as long as they're being treated well and loved. And
100%. Yeah,
yeah,
because like they need a village as they go through their life, right? Like the more people you have to support you in life, the easier your path generally is.
yes,
And like you said, so long as there's no like nefarious or malicious activity going on, which again, I think a lot of times, things can be taken out of context or misconstrued. And it's so important as adults to be able to be doing our own work and our own healing and our own path and figuring out like what you just said, right? You processing your emotions and saying, okay, we're not the same and we do things differently. And maybe she actually does certain things better, but that's okay. Because I do other
mhm,
things better, and my kids are getting two different sets of skills and knowledge and ways to do things, and that's wonderful for them. There's nothing wrong with that, right?
yes,
But that's not easy to do. And
no, yeah,
it's not. And unfortunately, I think not enough people surround themselves with the right support systems when they're going through divorce.
mhm,
And so the healing never happens or
yes,
doesn't happen till much later.
yes,
I'm a big believer that every person going through divorce should have a therapist. I tell all my clients, like, you know, my individual coaching clients, like, hey, you should have a therapist.
yeah,
I think, obviously I'm a divorce coach for a reason. I think that people need to have somebody to guide them through making rational decisions, being a sounding board, telling them like when they're going off the handle, being like, wait a minute, like let's
mhm,
rewind. Like, is this really the best path, or can we look at a couple of
yes,
options?
exactly,
Somebody to kind of check them.
yes,
And having the right other professionals involved. Unfortunately, a lot of attorneys in this space can stoke the conflict. So making sure you have one that is not doing that. Because
absolutely,
I tell my clients this all the time that divorces start and end the same way always, right? Someone decides to get divorced, and then at the end you have the final judgment and you're done. But that middle ground, what happens in between, is going to determine the rest of your life,
yeah,
period, and your children's.
mhm,
And so like a lot of times, unfortunately, this part totally degrades the co-parenting relationship, and then the
Yes.
healing doesn't happen. And
Yes.
then the rest of their lives are riddled with mess that came from this period.
Absolutely. And
And
that's why I
yeah,
think having a divorce coach is so important, because a divorce coach sees so many people through divorce. And
yeah,
if you have an attorney who is stoking or creating this very uh, animosity, angry war, or the other person, you can at least point that out and remind them that they have the ability to respond in certain ways, or possibly talk to their ex and see if they can change the tone. And I think nobody hopefully goes through more than one divorce. Many people
yeah.
do, but for most of us, it's a one-time thing. And uh, having someone to guide you without also spending $400 an hour to ask your
Right.
lawyer a question.
Every question, yeah. And trust me,
Yeah,
lawyers don't want to answer all those questions. They got enough going
no,
on
they
with their
don't.
actual
And they
work. They
don't
don't,
want to hear you cry or
no,
your worries about your kids. And
no.
so that's where I feel like divorce coaches really do come in. For the cost, it's so worth what you get out of it. Your return on investment is so worth it. And I feel like I even sometimes, with the emotional piece, I can use personal examples or examples that I'm seeing in other clients, and it just makes your client feel so much less isolated, or that their feelings and experiences are normal. And because
Mhm.
divorce tends to be a very isolating process. So
Yeah.
yeah, little plug for divorce coaches. Um,
Yeah, but it's unfortunately you see too often that people's entire, like the rest of their lives are defined by the bitterness from a short period of time.
oh,
And it's really awful.
absolutely.
You get one life, you get so many years on this earth. If you're lucky, maybe you get like 90.
Mhm.
I mean, if you live a
Right.
long
A
life, like
good
90,
one,
90,
yes.
95, that's like a great life, right?
Yes,
And you see people spend, you know, decades of that just
I
still bitter.
know.
And that's awful.
Angry, I
Sad,
know. Yeah. And and it's so unnecessary. It
right?
really is. Yeah. It's a story that people hold on to that just it hurts them more than anything else. And the
Right. And like really
kids.
none of it at the end of the day, like no matter what you went through, like the more that you focus on that, the less of
Yes.
the opposite you're gonna bring into your life and the less of the opposite you have time for. And so that's really, I think, when families blend and there's new people that get involved and there's step parents and so on, like the stuff that you're talking about, Lee, being able to say, you know what, and it might not be in your case, maybe it's cooking, but in other people's cases, it might be finances, right? Like, you know what? Their
Right.
stepmom's actually really good at managing finances, and I'm not so good at it. So
Yeah.
maybe like it's okay that she gives some advice on that and that she's helping them with that.
Right.
And she's really good at that, and I
Yes.
struggled with that my whole life, or
Mm.
whatever it is, right? Or like everybody's got different things they bring to the table. And so we just need to start seeing each other more of it as one team versus just like so, you know,
Yes.
positional and possessive
Right.
over the children and over like what we're bringing in. It's
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. And I think, it stems from insecurity and wanting to be loved, or concern that they're gonna like that house better, and uh working on those insecurities and questioning them, and why we're holding on to them is, I think, really helpful to kind of squash them when they're not helping you.
mhm.
So, yeah.
Yeah, no, totally. Again,
All right.
easier
Well,
said
this
than
was
done.
really, I feel like, a great interview. We covered a lot of topics, and if people want to reach out to you with questions, or where would they look for you?
Yeah, my website is floridadivorcecoaching.com. Again, Florida Divorce Coaching and Mediation. And yeah, you can just book with me on there. And I do free consultations. I'll do that indefinitely because you never know. Even if I'm not a fit for someone, there could be other professionals in my network that are a better fit for them. And I'm always happy to connect someone because at the end of the day, my goal is to do, as much as I can to prevent trauma for children and to have help families have better outcomes. So whether that means connecting them to a lawyer or a therapist or somebody that, you know, can help them, or another divorce coach, quite frankly, if I'm not the right fit for it, because sometimes I'm
Right.
not, you know, and that's okay.
Yes.
We all have different strengths. Literally speaking to what we just said, like we're here
Yes.
two divorce coaches having this conversation because like
Mhm.
neither of us view ourselves as competitors to one another. I guess
Right.
technically on paper, are we? Maybe. But there's
Mhm.
enough humans and enough work to go around for everyone. And someone that clicks with you might not click with me and vice versa. And that's again in the spirit of like taking the good from the different people, right? Like it's that same
Yes.
concept. We shouldn't go through life seeing
100%.
everyone as like a nemesis, because that's like a
Yes.
really bad way to go through life, right? We
Absolutely.
all have something to offer. So
Yes. So I will put all of your contact info in the show notes so people will be able to find you. And I really appreciate your time. Thank
yeah,
you,
thanks for
everybody,
having me.
for joining us. And we will see you in the next interview. Have a good one until then. Take
Yeah.
care.
Thanks, Lee. Bye.
You're welcome.